Welcome to the May 26th update of the analysis of the IHME COVID-19 forecasting model. My name is Alan Featherstone, and this is work done with Julia Maddock and Jonathan Featherstone. The outline of this presentation, we're going to take a look at the revisions since May 19th. We're again going to focus a little bit more on Kansas and the U.S. Mortality statistics. We'll focus a little bit about the social distancing by state. Then we'll take a look at the distributions of daily deaths compared to March 26th. Big focus will be on those states that relaxed their social distancing. And then we'll finish up with the cumulative deaths from the May 26th and the May 4th model. Again, the virus certainly is having a major effect on the economy. The unemployment rate is likely to be very close to 20% by the end of May. Since the middle of March, more than 39 million U.S. workers have filed for unemployment due to a shutdown of a significant share of the economy. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation played a large role in the formation of policy. It's really important to understand this, and this is going to be an update of the May 19th discussion. There was a major change in the modeling approach with the May 4th release, and we'll be able to track that a little further out now that we've had 3 weeks pass since that major revision when they increased the number of variables that they were modeling. Again, taking a look at this, the purple line is the original model. And then I have the May 1st, May 8th, May 17th revisions. Really in the last week there hasn't been major revisions in the model. In Kansas, essentially, you can see the May 1st, then it increased a little bit in terms of the PDF to the May 8th, and now that's fell back to the May 17th. If you look at that on a cumulative basis, essentially Kansas has kind of bounced around, and the most recent forecast here is this green line, which ultimately forecasts about 325 deaths within the state of Kansas. We look at the U.S., and the U.S. is one of these situations where it keeps on increasing, with the most recent estimates of 142,000 deaths by August 4th. New York, again, same type of thing going on essentially with the U.S., where by the August 4th you're looking at about 33,000 deaths. California, there's actually been some fairly large revisions going on there, where it increased from a little over 4,000 to a little under 7,000 by August 4th. Florida, it's pretty much the bouncing around here, same type of thing as Kansas, where essentially it dropped to about 4,000, then it increased the 8th of May to about 5,500, and now it's dropped to about 4,800 with the last model. Illinois continues to go up. Currently they're expected to be about 9,000, which is about 4 times, a little bit more than 4 times than the original projection. Texas, in terms of, again, a lot of movement from the different forecasts, dropped again, and then increased to the green line. One of the things I think that's really important is really to understand the risk associated here. The first graph here, or table, looks at the COVID deaths by age group. Basically, we're looking at, okay, is there any difference between the distribution across the age groups? In terms of, if we look at that, essentially, if you look at the 2018 mortality rates for Kansas, essentially 4.2% of the deaths are below 35 years of age. In terms of, you look at that though, you see a fairly similar relationship. We're a little bit higher on the 85 plus with 38.8%, a little bit lower on the 75 to 84, a little bit higher on both the 55 and 64. But if you look at this, one of the things you'll see is there's not much difference. If we look at this from U.S., and I was able to get the 2017 mortality rates for the U.S., and again, kind of break them down. One of the things you will end up seeing is that overall on the COVID deaths, I have all but 0.2% or 0.02%. And if you look at all deaths less than 15, there's roughly 1.13%. Again, looking at this and looking at the mortality rates, again, a little bit higher on the 75 to 84, a little bit higher on the 65 to 74. And then if you essentially look at anything less than 65, the distribution of those deaths is less at the younger age than the normal mortality. And so, again, it is important to realize in general, it does follow the distribution of overall mortality, a little bit higher in the 65 to 85 plus year categories. And so if you look at the three oldest age groups, you're seeing a little bit more on the COVID deaths by those numbers. In terms of if you look at this by basically just looking at the deaths per thousand, just to give you an indication of the overall mortality rate. In Kansas, we've had a little over 180 deaths. One of the things you'll see there is that essentially per thousand, we've had 1.11 deaths per thousand. That would be 0.1%. Normally, in that age group, in 2018, we had 142 deaths per 1,000, or 14.2%. In terms of, you can look at this in terms of essentially, you can see that the mortality numbers are quite a bit less. And again, you can argue that this is only 2.5 months as opposed to the year. And so if you want to multiply it by 6, again, you can still get a feel for the overall mortality. And so in Kansas, roughly, we look at 27,000 deaths a year. And in some respects, I think it's very important to realize that COVID certainly is important. But again, if we look at it overall deaths, there's a lot of other reasons people die. Then we end up looking at this from the U.S. perspective. Same type of thing in terms of in the U.S. Basically, 85 years plus is 3.5. One of the things I think this indicates is that Kansas has done relatively well in terms of, if you look at these numbers with the numbers in past, generally the deaths are higher in the U.S. as a whole than they are in Kansas. But again, if you want to multiply those by 6, it gives you a feel for what those might be on an annualized type basis, just a raw aspect. And 6 is probably a little bit high, but again, I think it does put this in the framework of what the overall risk is of death due to COVID. And again, any death is not good, but certainly sometimes when we are caught in something that has a media blitz, sometimes we get an idea that the mortality rates are maybe higher than they actually are. The next table I've put together here, and this has all come from the IHME with regards to social distancing by state. I looked at 3 orders: the stay-at-home, the business closure, and the gathering restrictions. The way to interpret this, for example, Alabama relaxed the stay-at-home on August 30th. They haven't allowed all businesses to be up and running, and they haven't allowed gathering restrictions to expire. Arizona is a little bit unique in that they essentially allowed everything to expire on May 16th. In terms of, if you look at the gathering restrictions, Idaho and Louisiana allowed those to expire May 1 and May 15th. The NA here means that they never had a stay-at-home order, and so you have states such as Iowa, Kentucky, Arkansas, Connecticut, where they never had a stay-home order. Missouri lifted everything on May 4th. North Dakota never had a gathering restriction. They also never had a stay-at-home order, as did New Mexico, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Massachusetts. In terms of South Dakota, they listed let their gathering restrictions expire April 28th. They never had a stay-at-home or a business closure. But again, this gives a little bit of indication there with regards to what's going on. And I think it's going to be important to look at some of these states as we move forward, simply because these are some of the early states that released, for example, Tennessee and Texas. We also have Mississippi opened up pretty early. And so in some cases, we've had 4 weeks since the opening. And why that is important, Colorado is April 27th. We look at Georgia, May 1st. But we've now had, in some cases, 3 or 4 weeks since these stay-at-home orders have been lifted. And so do we see some type of kink in the PDFs? This is kind of where we are overall from a U.S. perspective, and it does appear that we are starting a downward trend. Again, some of these numbers may be inflated a little bit, and I got this data from the COVID tracking project. One of the things, some states have rescinded the number of deaths. They went back and reclassified them. And while it was COVID related, perhaps it wasn't COVID caused. But if we look at that, certainly in the U.S., we're beginning to see a downward trend with regards to the actual deaths. In terms of looking at Kansas, and in some respects, since about the 10th of May, Kansas started reporting these on an every other day or an every third day basis. And so in some respects, there's more variability there than actually has been. One of the things you'll see in Kansas, pretty flat line. In terms of Colorado, in terms of one of the things to look at here, again, Colorado is one of those states that essentially released the stay-at-home early. Certainly, maybe you could argue that some of this was the repercussion for that, but again, if you look at it, it does look pretty straight over that most recent period. Nebraska, again, you could argue that perhaps this is maybe a little bit on an upward trend, but it looks like there's more variability here, which again can happen just because of the way statistics are reported. Missouri is another case that essentially opened everything up on May 4th. Again, a little bit more variability, but it would be hard to argue that it substantially shifted the curve up. Oklahoma, again, they've relaxed in some respects, and again, you can see a pretty flat curve. New York, you can end up seeing that they're on a downward trend. Again, this is a reporting issue where they had a lot of deaths that they hadn't reported that they did report. They were lumped in on one day. New Jersey, again, a lot of variability, but again, you can see that at least in the month of May, it appears that there's a downward trend. Same with regards to Connecticut, another downward trend. Massachusetts, high numbers. If you look at where they were from the original projections, they're much above, but again, they're trending down. Maryland is a little bit more flat. They're more within the distribution of what was originally forecast than, for example, New York and New Jersey. Delaware, again, seems to be fairly flat over the month of May. Rhode Island, perhaps a little bit of a downward trend. New Hampshire, a little bit of downward trend. Again, a lot of variability. Vermont, essentially, since the 9th of May, they've really only reported one death, and so Vermont is looking pretty clean. Maine's another state that's pretty clean, and in some respects, their curve was flat the entire time. Pennsylvania, certainly a lot of variability here. Again, you can see their experience has been much higher than what was projected. Again, you can see that there likely is a downward trend in deaths. Ohio, in some respects, is slightly less declining. Again, where they are right now is quite a bit higher than what was expected. Michigan, certainly on a downward trend, but again, much more than what was originally expected. Indiana, also on a downward trend, but again, at this point, they have higher loss of life than what was expected in the model. Illinois, in some respects, other than maybe this last week, has been relatively flat since about the 1st of May. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that continues to come down there or moves forward. Iowa, in some respects, didn't have a lot of statistics, but again, all the way through May at this point, it does look like they are on an increasing trend, but again, fairly low numbers compared to other states, but quite a bit higher than the original PDF distribution. Minnesota has been fairly flat over probably a 5-week period. Wisconsin, in terms of there was the Supreme Court order there that opened the state up. Again, you can see that it remains pretty flat the entire time. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to realize is that there never was that curve in many states. In terms of it appears the curves are flatter, and again, whether or not that's due to the social distancing or just due to model projections is pretty hard to ferret out at this point in time. Pretty flat in Georgia. Again, Georgia was one of those states that opened up fairly early in terms of about the 1st of May. And so in some respects, it looks like it's still decreasing a little bit, or at least flat, but there hasn't been a big spike. South Carolina, again, certainly could be data things in terms of all these zeros here. But in terms of looking at this, it does appear to follow the purple line maybe better than other states. North Carolina has been pretty flat the entire time. Virginia has remained pretty flat the whole time. In some respects, sometimes above the original projections, sometimes below. West Virginia has been very flat all the way since mid-April, and so some could argue all the way since all the way through in some respects. Kentucky generally has had a downward trend, except there was a peak there early last week. Tennessee, fairly flat over a period of time. Alabama, certainly fairly flat. And again, you just look at a lot of these states. Louisiana seems to have a downward trend. Again, they opened up fairly early compared to other states, and in some respects, it hasn't caused a spike. Arkansas, again, fairly flat, especially there was a kind of a spike in here around the 1st of May, end of April, but then that's remained fairly flat. Texas, another state that opened up again, tends to be a downward trend since that has occurred. New Mexico, again, has been fairly flat over May period. Arizona, they're completely opened up as of May 16th, which was somewhat around there. Again, you could argue that maybe it hasn't declined much, but it remains fairly flat over that period of time. Arizona will certainly see this next week as we pass through a year. And then fairly flat in Utah, fairly flat in Wyoming, again, just not much death. Montana, they haven't had a death since about the 1st of May. North Dakota, again, just not a lot of death due to COVID in North Dakota. Again, they really didn't close down like any of the other states. and generally, except for maybe a few points, they've been below the curve, the original. South Dakota, same type of thing. They've generally been below the curve. Idaho, again, a lot of variability there, but again, if you're looking at this, the highest was 6, and then the next highest with 3. Nevada, downward trend, again, fairly flat. California, fairly flat in some respects. A lot of time under the curve up until about the 7th of May. Again, the distribution is very flat there. Oregon, also very flat. You probably could draw a little bit of a decrease in that line. Washington, again, there was the spike early on. If you would throw out the one outlier there where they reported more than 70, it would have a downward trend. Alaska and then Hawaii have been well below the original projections. To maybe summarize, just a lot of flatness with regards to those curves. The next thing, we'll kind of look at where we are from the original model, looking at May 1st and beyond, and where we are with the May 4th projection when they drastically changed the model. U.S. deaths have actually been below the most recent model. Kansas deaths have been fairly close, but a little bit below. Colorado has actually experienced more death than the model would project, especially once you get past the 16th. Nebraska has been quite a bit below. Missouri, again, if you look at that past about the 10th, and again, they opened up on May 4th, they actually have had a little bit more cumulative death. Oklahoma has been below. New York has been below. Again, they're much above where it originally was, but more recently they haven't seen the death numbers on a cumulative basis as projected by the May 4th. New Jersey is a little bit low. Connecticut's coming in a little bit higher than the most recent projection. Massachusetts a little bit lower. Maryland a little bit higher. Delaware quite a bit lower, and again you can see the difference between the original projection and the May 4th projection. Rhode Island, they've experienced more cumulative death, and in some respects their experience is worse than either the April or March 26th or the May 4th model. New Hampshire, same type of thing with regards to the May 4th, they're a little bit higher. Vermont is pretty much on. Maine is right on in terms of looking at that. Pennsylvania is a little bit below. Illinois is a little bit below the May 4th. Michigan is below the May 4th projection, but again, they're quite a bit higher than the March 26th projection. Indiana below the May 4th projection by about 1,000 at this point in time, but they are a little bit more than 1,000 higher than the original projection. Illinois has been pretty close to the May 4th, again quite a bit above. Iowa's pretty close to the May 4th projection. Minnesota is actually experiencing a better situation than both the March 26th and the May 4th. Wisconsin's right on. Florida is right on. Georgia is experiencing a better outcome than what was projected either by the May 4th or the April 22nd projection. Same with South Carolina. Same with North Carolina. Virginia actually is a little worse than the March or May 4th projection, a little bit better than the March projection. West Virginia is pretty close to the May 4th projection, much less than the original projection. Kentucky is right on that orange line, a little bit better than the May projection. Tennessee is a little bit below that May 4th projection, quite a bit below the original projection. Same as Alabama. Alabama and Kentucky look pretty close. Mississippi is a little bit above the May 4th projection, quite a bit below the April or March 26th. Louisiana is right on. Again, about 800 people deaths or above the original projection. Arkansas, pretty close to the orange line, quite a bit below the original projection. Texas is under the most recent projection, quite a bit below the original projection. New Mexico is fairly close to the line, a little bit above, but quite a bit better than the original projection. Arizona, again, a little bit higher than the May 4th projection, quite a bit better, though, than the April 26th. We then move up Utah, again, a little bit higher than the May 4th, pretty close, or quite a bit better than the original projection. Wyoming is following the orange line fairly well. Again, if you look at the cumulative deaths, it's very, very low compared to what was originally projected. And so if you look at that on a percentage base, certainly it's quite a bit different. Montana, same type of thing, very close to the orange line, so much better than the original projection. North Dakota is a little bit higher. Again, North Dakota is one of these states that essentially is totally relaxed with regards to their social distancing. But again, if you look at it from the original projection, quite a bit better. It is a little bit higher than the May 4th. South Dakota was above, now they're below. The May 4th, Idaho is a little bit below. Nevada is right on that May 4th projection. California is a little bit above the May 4th projection, a little bit below the March 26th projection. In terms of, again, looking at Oregon, they're much better than the March 26th projection, and also a little bit better than the May 4th projection. Washington, again, a little bit better than the May 4th, quite a bit better than the March 26th. Alaska is a little bit better, but again, you look at the flatness of that line, there really hasn't been any death due to COVID for about 2.5 weeks in Alaska. Hawaii also is very flat. Again, this next 3 slides here just look at the percentage change from the original model to the most recent major release on May 18th. Again, it does give you a percentage difference with regards to what the August 4th per death projections are on each of these models compared to the original model. And so Alabama, the May 4th release, projected 33% more than the March 26 model. But as successive changes have been, it now is 10% below, 30% below. And so you can see that Alabama is experiencing a little bit better situation. And so you can study these numbers for each of the states with regards to, in some respects, how accurate that March 26 projection is, and then how that's changed with 3 subsequent releases, May 4th, May 11th, and May 18th. With that, again, the policy decisions really have resulted in large negative effects. Essentially, Glenn Tonser in the department estimated that the livestock, beef and pork in Kansas basically is looking at over probably about a $1.5 billion decrease in net income. In terms of looking at the situation in net farm income, in 2019 the net farm income was $110,000 per farm in Kansas Farm Management Association. Greg Eibendahl is estimating without the CARES Act government program payments, essentially the income would be $14,000 in the state of Kansas. Certainly there will be the payments that run through the CARE system, but essentially it's really important to look at this. In terms of some of the states that never implemented or never relaxed, you don't see a big difference with regards to changes. And so the experience pre and post has not been a big increase. Graphical analysis indicates that the model revision around the 1st of May is generally more accurate, although there are states that over and under predict the death situation. Again, I think it's really important to get our hands around this. Certainly, if there is a second wave, I think this information can be pretty useful for individuals thinking through how they will manage policy if there was a second wave. With that, we thank you for your attention. We will see you next week when we will update this model again. Thank you.